Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here today. You may remember me. My name's Jerry, and I do IT work for the History Freak. I was real excited about today's episode that's being recorded. We've got a very special guest that's going to talk to us today around the Spanish-American War. And being a Navy veteran, it's an interesting war to me. In some respects, with the attack on the USS Maine. And I also found it interesting doing a little bit of research today that our relations with Cuba over the decades have really changed. Back in the beginning of the Spanish-American War, we were the recipient of about 90%, from what I read, of Cuba's exports. So this is going to be very educational for me. I believe it'll be very educational to all of the History Freaks audience. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, as you know, the History Freak, and our very special guest, Ed Bomsey, of a great autograph and collectible site that I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about today. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Jason.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. And it's a pleasure to be with you again on another episode of The History Freak. And we're going to be talking about collecting the Spanish-American War today. We're also going to be continuing on our segment of U.S. history and collecting. We, of course, did the episode on the Civil War, Union Navy, followed by the Indian Wars. And now we're going to be sort of culminating that with a discussion of the Reconstruction Period and the Spanish-American War. So I'd like to introduce our special guest, Ed Bomsey. He has decades of experience collecting, buying, and selling as a dealer. He's a member in the Manuscripts Society, and he's a historian in his own right. And he calls in today from the great state of Virginia. And his website is Bomsey-Autographs.com. And I'll be showing that website URL at other points during this discussion. So without further ado, I'd like Ed, if you would kindly say hi, and then I'll pose a question.
Hello, Jason. Hello to your audience. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Ed. And let's dive right in. I see you're in your office there. That's a very good work site for you. We've been talking about this evolution of the United States, and a lot would start off focusing on the founding era. However, I've chosen to start as a nexus point around the Civil War timeframe. So we've done a couple episodes, as you know. I'd like to pose the question to you. What led the United States to become a world and imperial power leading up to the Spanish-American War, and then culminating with the Spanish-American War as the kickoff of that. But first, I'd like to sort of have you go over some of the interesting items that you've collected, bought, and sold through the years, and feel free to share some of those.
Sure, it's a pleasure. One of the probably fun things I ever had in my life as a dealer was selling a complete set of Napoleon's Marshals letters. There were 26 Napoleon's Marshals. Several of them died during the Napoleonic Wars. One particularly, Marshal Ney, was executed by Napoleon's forces. Very difficult to get a complete set of letters, and it was really a great thrill to put it together and be able to find a good home for them. My own particular passion is collecting autographs of the United States Supreme Court, and I have the distinction of being one of the few people that I know who has a collection of everyone who has ever served on the court up to the justices who are there today. a colleague of mine just divested himself of his collection, put it up on auction, and so at least I can say I'm the only one who's got a complete set in private hands that I know of.
Fantastic. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I saw that on your website today too. I found that really interesting. I noticed when I was looking through, I didn't see Ruth Bader Ginsburg listed, but it sounds like you have one of her autographs now as well.
I've had several items of hers. I didn't have any on the website because they've been sold. But just about a few years ago, when she began to develop health problems, she basically decided she was no longer signing autographs. And very understandable.
Oh, Ed, I appreciate that. I am very interested in your collection, and I know that it's served me very well for my collecting hobby throughout the last nearly 2 decades. So very pleased at that. I guess turning now to the whole notion of the U.S. becoming a world power and then sort of manifesting that at the Spanish-American War. Talk about, if you will, your interest in collecting and some history throughout the period of the Reconstruction period up until the Spanish-American War, so it can dovetail with some of the episodes that I've done and will continue to do.
Well, the Reconstruction era basically is from 1865 until 1877. During the Civil War, I mean, even here in Virginia, federal troops crossed over into Alexandria in 1861 and basically took over the city of Alexandria, which they turned into a Union seaport. So parts of Northern Virginia were basically held by federal troops, including Lee's own home, the Custis Lee Mansion, which is basically an Arlington cemetery. So as the war progressed, federal troops took more and more Confederate lands, Confederate states. Federal troops were taking control. And when the peace was signed at Appomattox, federal troops basically were everywhere all over the former Confederacy and eventually coming into Texas, which was the last holdout. Now, needless to say, the residents of the former Confederate states were not happy. And one reason they were not happy was because all of a sudden the freedmen, former slaves, were coming into political power. You had African Americans who were elected to Congress, to the House, African Americans elected to the Senate. Local control was turned over to freemen. And there was a great deal of resentment. Resentment which basically turned into the development of the Ku Klux Klan and other similar organizations. Reconstruction lasted basically until the election of 1876, which I just noted. That election was, until the election of 2000, the closest election that had ever been held. In fact, it came down to the point where Samuel Tilden, who was the Democratic candidate, was leading 185 electoral votes to 164 for the Republican Hayes. There were 3 states that had contested results: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Well, what to do? There was a deal. Rutherford B. Hayes's people, the Republicans, made a deal with the Southern electors that if they backed Hayes, one of the first things he would do would be to remove federal troops from the South. So the unholy bargain was made. The 20 votes went to Hayes, who won by 185 electoral votes to 184 for Tilden. 1 electoral vote difference. The federal troops left and control basically of the southern states very quickly reverted to the former Confederates. And sadly, it was a very bloody, horrible time. It was a really very sad chapter in American history, which basically has gone on through much of the 20th century.
Now, I understand that you may have some collectibles from this era, autographs and such. We'd love to see any during this episode here.
Well, first thing I have here is a document signed by President Rutherford B. Hayes as president. It's dated 1880. It's a warrant for a conditional pardon of a felon. Here is also an 1882 letter. It's 2 pages of Samuel J. Tilden. This is the front page, and here's the back page with his autograph.
Fascinating, fascinating.
And in that period too, here is an autograph that came from an autograph album of a gentleman named Blanche K. Bruce, who was an African-American. He was the first elected Republican senator from Mississippi. And along with that is another piece from an autograph album of a gentleman named Robert Smalls, who was a South Carolina slave who led a daring escape by sea in 1862 by basically disguising himself in a captain's uniform. He had been a seaman and took himself and his family on a little coastal steamer, South Carolina and Charleston, and gave a little wave to the guards. It was at night, hat pulled close over his head, and steamed all the way into the Union lines. When the war was over, he came back and was a congressman from Beaufort, South Carolina.
Wow, that's a great story.
A lot of others. They're just a heck of an interesting period in history.
That's wonderful. That's very informative, and I think those stories are a delight to our audience as they decide what they want to collect, and there's no shortage of collectibles of this era, and that's why I always trust experts like yourself for my own collection. Now that we sort of teed it up, can you sort of guide us in a little about the Spanish-American War and the McKinley administration and tensions at the time, and then we'll get into other topics about it.
It basically, the 1890s was sort of the beginning for us of the age of imperialism. We were no different than the British, no different than the French, the Germans. Wherever we could go to put our imprimatur, we were happy to go and do so. The Spanish-American War was called the Splendid Little War. Was a term used by Secretary of State John Hay to Theodore Roosevelt. There was a splendid book called The Splendid Little War, which I read many years ago, still in print, by a gentleman named Frank Friedel, which I thought was probably one of the definitive histories of the Spanish-American War. There are not a whole lot of books written about that, but I can certainly remember that and recommend that one. The war lasted basically 5 months. it was from April to August of 1898. As you mentioned, we got in it through the sinking of the Maine. Whether a controversial incident, shall we say. But the wonderful thing was, after that war was over, we were not only a Caribbean power, but we were also a Pacific power. The Treaty of Paris gave us temporary control of Cuba, and Spain also ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Was an enormous growth for us. What I think is wonderful is some of the personalities in that era who really are quite notable. And not only Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley, but William Randolph Hearst, who
Yes.
basically was the press lord, who said something about, you get me the pictures, I'll make the war. Admiral Dewey, Frederick Remington, Aguinaldo, the Philippine leader, General Leonard Wood. Was also rather remarkable is you had some Confederate generals who
Yes.
rejoined the Union Army, like Matthew Culbraith Butler and Fitzhugh Lee.
Yes.
So it was really a remarkable period of conquest. One of the, I think the great noteworthy battles was, of course, the Battle of San Juan Hill. And I have a little picture over here framed, and you can see, if it's clear enough, there's Theodore Roosevelt on his horse in uniform, signed as Colonel of United States Volunteers, and it's in September 1898, which was basically right after he got home.
That's remarkable. What a piece of history
Yeah.
in your collection there.
It's one of my all-time favorites. Absolutely.
That's absolutely exciting to see that. I would say, I've been a fan of this history surrounding this short, splendid war, as you have said, for many years. And some of the things I read was, and have seen many documentaries on it, that it was an amalgam of America at the time. There were African-American units. There were literal cowboys from the Western United States. There were Native American Indians that participated in the volunteer force. And then there were Ivy League elites from the East Coast, which Roosevelt came. And
Yes.
one of the fascinating, interesting stories was that when they disembarked from the transport ships from Tampa off the coast of Cuba and got into rowboats, and out of them, of course, some of these cowboys from the Wild West didn't know how to swim, and they referred to the ocean as the quote-unquote crick. So I thought that was a very funny and humorous story. Can you imagine the chaos disembarking those rowboats and getting onto the shores of Cuba? Well, that's incredible, Ed. I want to thank you immensely for joining us today, and I hope that perhaps later in the year you would consider doing another segment for the History Freak on a as of yet identified topic that we'll do.
It would be my great pleasure, Jason. I got to just tell you one thing. When I was in college, I was a history major, and I always thought that I would love to teach history until I found out what history teachers made. So now I kind of feel that I'm teaching history by buying and selling it, and it's wonderful to be on your program, and I think you're doing a splendid job as well of teaching history by displaying it in all its forms. You're doing a great job, a great service.
Yeah, and I would have to agree. I've jibed with Jason a number of times, saying he missed his calling as a history teacher, and I would take classes from either of you if I was of college going age.
Thank you both, and welcome again to another episode of the History Freak. We've got some exciting collectibles to show you on the Spanish-American War, including, as always, autographs, manuscripts, and documents, as well as original ephemera, artifacts, uniforms, and weapons of the period. So from all of us at the History Freak, have a wonderful day and enjoy watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you both. Appreciate very much. It's a great honor.
And now let's take a look at The Splendid Little War by Frank Friedel. Courtesy of Ed Bomsey Autographs, inside the book's cover, I have included the autographs of 5 commissioners of the peace deal that ended the war. I love the original photos and illustrations littered throughout the book. Now let's take a look at original autographs and manuscripts of the era. And here's a typed letter signed by Admiral of the Navy and victor of the Battle of Manila Bay, George Dewey. This letter dates to 1899 to John Long, Navy Secretary. And here's a clipped signature from a document of 25th President of the United States, William McKinley, the last president to serve in the Civil War, who served as an enlisted soldier in the Union Army. He was assassinated in 1901. Here's a period photo and another clipped signature of U.S. Army Major General and physician and military governor of Cuba and the Philippines, Leonard Wood. Next, we have a print and a portion of a handwritten letter signed as minister to Austria-Hungary of Frederick Dent Grant, the son of Ulysses S. Grant, commissioned as a colonel in 1898. Promoted to brigadier general, he served in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Also from Bomsey Autographs, a clipped signature of Elwell Stephen Otis, the general in the U.S. Army who served in 1899 at the Battle of Manila. And here from Ed Bomsey as well, a clipped signature of John R. Brooke, the governor of Cuba. And here's a wonderful print that accompanies a post-presidential typed letter signed by T.R. on behalf of the Outlook publication. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley and resigned to lead the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War as Colonel of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. The picture accompanies it of T.R. and the Rough Riders after taking San Juan Hill. And last but not least, a signed envelope to family from the former Confederate cavalry general turned Major General of Volunteers appointed by McKinley. Fightin' Joe Wheeler became nominal second in command of the 5th Army Corps during the Spanish-American War. Now let's round things out with a lovely print I obtained on the internet of the Battle of Manila Bay with the famous Dewey quote, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Well, welcome everyone to another edition of The History Freak. I'm Jason, the History Freak. Now we've heard some great stories from Ed Bomsey in this episode. We've also seen the book, The Splendid Little War, and we've lastly seen some incredible autographs of the period. Now we're going to showcase an 1898 to 1900 era almost complete uniform. We're talking United States Army, we're talking Rough Rider period, United States Volunteers era, 1898, Spanish-American War, actions in Cuba, actions in the Philippines, and into the Philippine insurrection and governor period. Our first stop from our friends at Bay State Militaria, an original campaign hat circa 1900, 1899 period. Notice the headband and sweatband is very frail, but the great condition of the hat. Pan down and you'll see some late 1800s period spectacles or eyeglasses. I give this a little nod to Teddy Roosevelt, TR. Now let's go for the jacket. United States Volunteers, 9th Pennsylvania Regiment on the lapel. Standard issue buttons, a few moth holes, but incredible condition. I have Bay State Militaria to thank for this wonderful piece. Let's pan over to the guidon. Here's an early 20th century cavalry guidon, not dissimilar to what the Rough Riders would have used when on campaign. And last but not least, the Mills cartridge belt, canvas period belt with ammunition pockets, and makes a nice accoutrement to the ensemble. Okay, now very gently, let's check out this New York Journal from July 2nd, 1898. Here I have it displayed, talks about the fierce action in the Caribbean. As you could see, an original Spanish-American War era newspaper. What a wonderful piece of history. Next, we'll pan over to the backpack. Leather is in not the greatest condition, but bears the stencils of regiment marks, and a little cleanup and conditioning of the leather, and it would be quite good shape. Let's check out a original first aid packet from the Spanish-American War era in a wax paper. Next we have the spectacles or eyeglasses case, which does open and close and stores the glasses quite nicely. A period razor, a straight razor, and shaving tin, if you will. A U.S., if you could see the U.S. emblem inside, ceramic mug. Now notice in the History Freak episode, if you'll recall, on the Indian Wars, we showcased a different kind of mug. So this changed to a ceramic type around the time of the Philippine insurrection and Spanish-American War. Next, we have a nice period canteen. Again, the leather's a bit cracked, but these are eminently available online. Plenty of these around in addition to haversacks. And lastly, the gaiters. This is a pair in incredibly good condition. I'm not sure if the clasps have been replaced. They may have, but these are new old stock. Thank you. Next, we have an experimental brace system behind the uniform. As you'll recall from the Indian Wars episode, we showed you a Palmer brace system. This is a wonderful and rare experimental brace system made of wood and leather, obtained from a wonderful dealer in Montana. Now, to complete the United States volunteer members' weaponry, we are going to take a step back to our last episode where we did it on the Indian Wars, and we showcased, in very dramatic History Freak style, I might add, the Springfield trapdoor rifle circa 1870s. which was an innovation above and beyond the carbines that were used in the Civil War period. Now, the next evolution came along in 1892 based on the Norwegian Krag Jorgensen rifle. Springfield adopted it and gave birth to the Springfield 3040 Krag carbine. And guess what? We have one to showcase for you today. As you can see, we have the 1892 to 1896 original US bayonet attached to the carbine. Now, right away, you'll notice a difference from the trapdoor rifle. Let me do the bolt action. Here is the loader. This compartment here would come down and you could fit 5 rounds easily inside. And you didn't have to load them very carefully. You could drop them in simply. Close the bolt and discharge the weapon. As you can see, a vast improvement over the trapdoor. Now here's the sight, which is pretty clever. Not the greatest sight in the world, but and not a clinometer, that's for sure, but quite effective at longer ranges. So the complete carbine, these Krags are getting rarer and rarer to find in this condition. Many have been sporterized, but this is the original non-sporterized version, 1892 to 1896 Krag. Well, now that you've seen the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War with touches on Reconstruction, the Civil War prior to that, we're telling a story. We're telling a story of history through collecting. Now, we'll continue on with more episodes on the First World War, the Second World War. We'll probably do another one on Spanish-American War era Navy. And we'll also touch on the Civil War. And I have episodes planned which include the Great Republic of Texas as well. So wait till you see me in a cowboy hat. So I'd like to wish you a happy fall. And as I always say, stay in the past.